Last week at Lakewood's Drive, we discussed Moses as a type of Christ, which is to say, he told the story of Jesus before Jesus came on the scene. And not perfectly, of course. No type is going to be absolutely perfect because Jesus was perfect and human beings, the rest of us anyway, are not. But he tells the story in a very remarkable way and in several different ways, in fact. And I referred to Acts chapter 7, and I wanted to go back to Acts chapter 7 today and look at the story of Moses at large, not so much in terms of typology, but to look at the character development that we see in the life of Moses. If you want to see Moses as a type of Christ, on one hand, here today we're going to look at Moses as an example of a believer, an example of one who would follow after God, an example of obedience, essentially. We'll get to the obedience in a little bit. I'd like to read in Acts chapter 7, going back to verse number 17 or so. It's a rather lengthy reading, but I think we probably would do with all of it here today. Verse 17 down through verse number 36. As the time was approaching to fulfill the promise that God had made to Abraham, the people flourished and multiplied in Egypt, until a different king who did not know Joseph ruled in Egypt. He dealt deceitfully with our race and oppressed our ancestors by making them abandon their infants outside so they wouldn't survive. At this time, Moses was born, and he was beautiful in God's sight. He was cared for in his father's home for 3 months. When he was put outside, Pharaoh's daughter adopted and raised him as her own son. So Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was powerful in his speech and actions. When he was 40 years old, he decided to visit his own people, the Israelites. When he saw one of them being mistreated, he came to his rescue and avenged the oppressed man by striking down the Egyptian. He assumed his people would understand that God would give them deliverance through him, but they did not understand. The next day he showed up while they were fighting and tried to reconcile them peacefully, saying, "Men, you're brothers, why are you mistreating each other?" But the one who was mistreating his neighbor pushed Moses aside, saying, "Who appointed you a ruler and a judge over us? Do you want to kill me the same way you killed the Egyptian yesterday?" When he heard this, Moses fled and became an exile in the land of Midian, where he became the father of 2 sons. After 40 years had passed, an angel appeared to him in the wilderness of Mount Sinai in the flame of a burning bush. When Moses saw it, he was amazed at the sight. As he was approaching to look at it, the voice of the Lord came, "I am the God of your ancestors, the God of Abraham, of Isaac, and of Jacob." Moses began to tremble and did not dare to look. The Lord said to him, "Take off the sandals from your feet, because the place where you are standing is holy ground. I have certainly seen the oppression of my people in Egypt. I have heard their groaning and have come down to set them free, and now come, I will send you to Egypt." This Moses, whom they rejected when they said, "Who appointed you a ruler and a judge?" this one God sent as a ruler and a deliverer through the angel who appeared to him in the bush. This man led them out and performed wonders and signs in the land of Egypt, at the Red Sea, and in the wilderness for 40 years. Now, the number 40 comes up 3 times in this context, you'll notice. Moses lived for a total of 120 years, according to the scriptures, and it divides very neatly into 3 sections of 40 years apiece. And these 40 years characterize 3 different lives, essentially, 3 different approaches, 3 different attitudes in the life of one of the greatest characters in the Bible. And what I'd like to do is kind of look at those 3 lives, as it were, and look at the efforts that we may be making as the people of God and how they may fall short, and how ultimately, with patience and with the grace of God, we're able to push through and actually present to God what he requires of us, as Moses did. Not perfectly, of course. Moses didn't do it perfectly either. But at least we can understand what it means to be obedient. And we'll have a word to say about that as we close. The first 40 years I'm characterizing as the life of a prince. And in that life, we see confidence without humility. As he is growing up among the Egyptians, he obviously has some concept of his Hebrew heritage. We don't have a lot of information about that. It seems he maintained contact with his family. There was never really any question about who he was in the flesh, but he was living in the palace. He was living among the princes. He evidently, Stephen here by inspiration gives us some a little bit more detail about how Moses spent those 40 years. We don't have that in the Bible, but the Hebrew tradition is quite consistent with this. Josephus, in his Annals of Jewish History, he describes this also, that Moses was a great man by conventional standards, even as a Hebrew among the Egyptians. And he chose, at the end of this 40-year period, to use that power, to use that influence, to use that training to rise up as a leader for the people and deliver them from their oppressors. Now, was he trained to do this? Was he taught to do this by his parents? The text does not say. But one thing we do understand by implication, and that is that he does not receive this message from God. He will receive this message from God later, 40 years later. But right now, this is all his idea. It's not a bad idea necessarily, but it's not God's idea. And because he proceeds with confidence, but confidence in himself and in his mission to a certain degree, perhaps, but not necessarily confidence that's rooted in God, and certainly not rooted in the revelation of God, he winds up coming to nothing. And regardless of how your plans or my plans may or may not work out in this life in the short term, or even in the 20 or 40-year term or whatever, the obvious demonstrations of success that we may see, that we may use to judge our efforts, are not the end-all be-all. Even if Moses had succeeded in turning these two Israelites to his favor and raised up a small army with regard to his plans to liberate Israel, I have no doubt that he would have failed in the end, because this wasn't God's plan. At least it wasn't God's plan yet. This wasn't the means by which God would accomplish his plans. And I can't help thinking that this is on purpose. And certainly God raised up deliverers at various times, and some of them weren't outstanding examples of faith. No question about that. Some of them were scoundrels. Some of them were just out and out sinful people. Jehu comes immediately to mind. Jeroboam comes immediately to mind. And others we could talk about also. Some, of course, very, very flawed. Samson, for instance. But even the best of them, even the noblest of them, if they were going to do God's will, they had to be directed by God. And Moses was in the path of God's providence. There's no question he was going to be a tool in God's hand, but not yet, and not in this way. Moses didn't understand that. That was partly because it was not God's plan yet to have him understand that. Partly it was because Moses had some skill sets yet to acquire to perfectly accomplish God's purposes, most notably humility. It does not seem that humility is Moses' thing at this point. There's certainly no indication of it. In Jeremiah chapter 10, verse number 23, we're told there that the way of man is not in himself, depending on the translation there. It's not a man who walks to direct his steps. And in that context, in Jeremiah, really the whole book of Jeremiah, but especially chapter 10, it's an indication of what kind of a mess we get ourselves into when we think that our plan is the end-all be-all, that we are responsible personally for coming up with some kind of agenda, some kind of approach, some kind of tactic that will get us from here to there, even if it's God's plan, or at least our vision of God's plan. Coming up with this method on our own is going to result in disaster. It's going to result in failure, eternally at least, because the only way we can possibly accomplish his purposes is through faith. And Moses is not acting in faith here. Moses is acting in power. He's acting in confidence, which is fine as far as that goes. Nothing wrong with being confident. Nothing wrong with having power. But when it's not coupled with humility, we get ourselves into trouble. This is true whether you're talking about the Gentile world, the pagan world at large that Paul's referring to in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, or talking about the people of God, talking about the Diotrephes of the world, who may in their own mind anyway mean well, but are not doing things God's way. The world through his wisdom did not come to know God, 1 Corinthians 1 verse 21 says, and the same thing is going to be true for people who name the name of Jesus. If you are coming up with the plan on your own, and you're not patient enough to wait for God to reveal his plan, and you're not faithful enough to listen to that plan when it has been revealed, then God's purposes are not going to be served. Well, let me rephrase that. God's purposes in your own life are not going to be served. You may be able to do some great things. You may baptize a lot of people. You may teach a lot of people. You may on the surface anyway, put up some great numbers. But the only way that you yourself can be pleasing to God is by coupling that confidence with a sense of humility, knowing that you are not the star of the show. Jesus is always going to be the star of the show. Moses didn't understand that, not fully. He needed to learn that. And that's why he went to Midian, which brings us to the second life that Moses lived, a life of obscurity, a life of service, a life spent in the wilderness, tending sheep. And it's kind of interesting how often the idea of tending sheep comes up in the story of Jesus and the story of the precursors to Jesus, Abraham and David and Moses, obviously, and Amos and others as well. The idea of tending sheep is seen as a training ground for spiritual leaders. In the New Testament, leaders of the church, directors of local groups of saints are called shepherds. This is not an accident. God shows us as the good shepherd himself. Jesus calls himself the good shepherd in John chapter 10. The Lord is my shepherd. Yahweh is my shepherd. I shall not want in Psalm 23. This shepherding aspect of our character brings out humility. And usually shepherding is coupled with the idea of humility. It's not a glorifying kind of thing. There aren't a whole lot of famous shepherds out there in the world. That's not how you get fame and fortune. That is how you learn service in the text. And Moses was lacking in that. And after 40 years of that, God thinks he's ready. And Moses does not think he's ready, which is kind of an interesting twist in all this. Stephen, in his sermon here in Acts chapter 7, doesn't go into these details here, but we see in Exodus chapter 3, when and on in chapter 4, etc. It's quite a long story. We'll go back and read in all of that. But Moses has to be dragged kicking and screaming into this job, a job that he volunteered for, a job that he assumed was his 40 years previously. And God seems to be kind of exasperated at him at times, and to a certain degree conceding Moses' claims of self-inadequacy, etc. I'll give you Aaron as a mouthpiece if you don't think you're a good enough talker or whatever. Just go out and do the job. And Moses, you send whoever you want to send. And God says, I am sending whoever I want to send. I'm sending you. And, humility can be taken too far in this sense. And maybe that's a poor way of phrasing it. Humility is always a good thing. But humility needs to be coupled with a certain amount of confidence. Right? And Romans chapter 8, verse 31, God is for us. Who can be against us? That is a statement of confidence that we have, not because of our greatness. Moses got that much right. He's not a great one in the world. But God can make him great. And he has to have enough confidence that with God's help, with God's direction, with God's power, great things can be accomplished. Our faith can overcome the world, the text says in 1 John chapter 5, verse 4. The assurance, the confidence that should couple with our meekness or humility or gentleness, depending on your translation, in Matthew chapter 5, verse 5. This one will inherit the earth, Jesus says there in the Sermon on the Mount. And the point seems to be, quoting from the Psalms, or at least referencing the Psalms, that when you are assuming responsibility for claiming your inheritance by your own strength, by your own power, etc., there's going to come around somebody who's stronger than you are. And eventually you're going to lose what you have claimed for yourself, if only in death. The way that we truly claim the earth, the way that we truly claim our proper intelligence, our proper inheritance, I should say, all that God has waiting for us is not by being strong enough to take it, but by being humble enough to accept it when God has given it to us, and then confident enough to step up and say, yes, I am a child of God. Yes, I am working on his behalf. Yes, I am entitled to this, not because of me, but because of what has been done for me. Moses was not ready to do that after 40 years. He had another lesson to learn. He unlearned the one lesson. Now he has to unlearn the other lesson, I guess you might say. When he is able to put these two pieces together, he's able to have confidence and he's able to have humility. He enters into career number 3, I guess you would say, being God's man. And for 40 more years, he does this. He is able to do both. He's able to juggle both of these balls at the same time that may seem on the surface to be incompatible, but they're not. They are absolutely compatible. And for 40 years first in Egypt and then in the wilderness. He's God's man in both of these areas. He is able to show how the people of God can be confident in their salvation, confident in their relationship with God, confident in the inheritance that is coming to them, and a foretaste of which they already have. All that confidence, and yet be humble before their God. Moses is described there in Numbers chapter 12, verse 3 as the meekest man, the humblest man on the earth, which I've always thought perhaps that was some kind of editorial insertion by Joshua or some later editor. The story of Moses' death, of course, also occurs in the book of Deuteronomy. Clearly, that wasn't written by Moses. It would seem like it was written by Moses. It's reasonable to assume that an editor kind of put all this together. Maybe an editor inserted verse number 3 because it really doesn't seem to fit very well at all in the context of Numbers chapter 12. It's talking about the uprising of Aaron and Miriam, people who should have known better than this, who shouldn't have been jealous of their little brother, and yet were, it seems. Moses is having to put up with this nonsense, not just from Korah and other rebels, but from his own family. And in that context, we're told specifically that Moses was more humble than anyone. The idea that he's objecting to this rebellion, not because it takes away from himself, but because it takes away from God, because it is presumptuous, because it's bad news for Aaron and Miriam, not to mention the people of God. It's not bad news for Moses. Moses embraces opportunity to pass off responsibility, pass off obligation, and pass off glory. He, in many places, I wish the whole nation were prophets. The idea of having the confidence that I am walking in God's way, and yet being humble enough to share the glory, to dismiss the glory, to not accept it, to pass it off, to be humble. This is the lesson that Jesus teaches us. He shows it in his own self. In Matthew chapter 11, verse number 29, we're told there that we're supposed to learn from him. And learn what? We'll learn how to be gentle and humble in spirit. Meek and lowly in heart, the Old King James Version has there. This is a lesson that Jesus exemplified in his own life perfectly. Moses wasn't perfect. He had his outbursts, he had his arrogance, and ultimately he was held accountable for that. Jesus did not, of course. Jesus is the perfect example of obedience, and I wanted to kind of close out with that, referring to Hebrews chapter 5 and verse number 8, where we're told there that Jesus learned obedience through suffering. And his point there is, well, it's not that there were certain things about obedience that Jesus didn't know while he was walking around here on earth. And eventually people beat him up and crucified him to the point where, okay, now I understand what obedience actually is. I really, really do not think that's what the text means there. I suspect it means this or something pretty close to this, that by going through what he went through, by seeing what obedience really is, he experiences things that he had not experienced, that he could not have experienced in heavenly realms. And through that shows himself to be submissive and obedient in every situation. And as such, he shows himself to be an example for us. That's what Moses is doing. And that's the takeaway that I want to offer here in this lesson, to help us see in Moses an example, and see in Jesus too, of course, an example of being confident and being humble at the same time, and allowing God's grace, God's providence, God's power to work in us, not for our own glory, but for his glory. And whatever glory we may get in so doing, as Moses did, pass it off, as Jesus did, pass it off, deflect it. This is not about my will. This is about my Father's will. This is all about the greater good, the greater cause. It's about other people, not exalting myself above others, but exalting others to this level that I have found for myself by God's grace, and that you can find too. Having this confidence and this humility that the child of God, the worker of God, the man or the woman of God can and will accomplish tremendous things, not because they were so ingenious or powerful or clever or adventurous or what have you, but because God does amazing things with little people. Regardless of where you may be on the pecking order, as you may define pecking order, you can and you will be a force for righteousness when you put yourself in the hand of God and allow Him to take you where He's going to take you, and simply doing what He has asked you to do. It has happened to many, many humble shepherds in the sheepfolds over the years, over the centuries. He'll do it for you as well. So learn the lesson of confidence, but also learn the lesson of humility that God is trying to teach us through Moses. By getting both of these lessons at the same time, then we're going to be able to really be something, not for our glory again, but for His. Thank you very much for following along. I hope this is a blessing to you. I hope you can grow in your faith and your commitment toward the things of God in this way and every way. God bless.